Good morning, everyone. It is certainly a pleasure to be with you today. And thank you again to Mark and to the folks at the Truman Library for the invitation to speak. I've gotten to speak at a couple of the teacher workshops before, and have always thoroughly enjoyed getting to meet teachers and getting to learn more. It's a treat for us, and I hope you'll see it the same way as well. Give me just a moment. I'm going to pull my presentation up for us. Get that started. Let's go. There it is. All right. So, folks, I do like, just to echo Mark's thoughts, I am sure that Zoom fatigue is real and you are tired of it and your students are tired of it, and we get a little tired of it too. So, as I present today, please, by all means, throw your questions as we go into the chat function. I should be able to see those pretty well. If not, perhaps Therese or Mark can help get those to me. But I'm going to hope to make this as interactive as we can. So please do respond. I'm looking very much forward to your thoughts. I decided to craft our program today, gave it the title King Andrew I, the People's President. And I hope what you noticed immediately is like, wait a second, you can't be the king and the people's president at once. Andrew Jackson finds a way often to be both things at the same time. If you are teaching Andrew Jackson, you are certainly well versed in Jackson's many dichotomies, in many of the ways in which Andrew Jackson just does one thing, says another. You expect one thing, he does another, advocates for one thing, and then flips it on its head. So I feel like this tension in being a king and a president is pretty endemic to Andrew Jackson, and I think you'll see that as we go. But what it did let me focus on was looking at Jackson's nickname. So the theme of the conference this week was about presidential character and decision making. And I think when we look at Andrew Jackson's character and some of the ways in which he makes decisions, I began to think how many nicknames Andrew Jackson has and how well those nicknames capture some very specific moments in Jackson's life, not only the presidency, the military, and his private life, and all of these experiences that he's going to have that help him earn these nicknames are going to very much be reflected in his decision making. I look at other presidents down the road, and sometimes I look at some of their nicknames and I think, oh, it's just a play on their actual name, right? I like Ike, Dwight Eisenhower, and so forth, Honest Abe. And some of these nicknames that they pick up in a way are sort of just a play on their names. It's catchy. Maybe it looks great on a campaign button or a campaign poster somewhere. But for Jackson, these nicknames are far less about, just a play on words or a play on an idea, and much more connected to his life experiences. So let me go ahead and move forward, and we'll talk about some of these nicknames. Now, I realized just about 10, 15, 20 minutes ago that when I sat down to work out these nicknames, I put them in chronological order according to the experiences of his life, rather than the order in which he received these nicknames. And I feel like that might have been an oversight. So I'll see what you have to say. But we'll start with Jackson's early life. For those of you who may not be terribly familiar with Jackson's biography, very quickly, let me recap. So Jackson is born in the Carolinas, possibly North Carolina, possibly South Carolina. Jackson certainly forwarded the idea that he was born in South Carolina. This is where Jackson is going to get that very first nickname, and that nickname that so many of us know today. And that was the nickname, the Brave Boy of the Waxhaws. So as Andrew Jackson is growing up on the Carolina frontier, his family has already experienced considerable hardship. They had been immigrants from Ireland, Jackson, of course, being born here once his parents have arrived. His father died in 1767, just within 3 weeks or so of Jackson's birth, which was March 15th. According to common histories, the elder Jackson was chopping down a tree. The tree fell on him, and he died of his injuries shortly thereafter. So by the time Andrew Jackson is born, he has two older brothers, and he is fatherless. His mother is Elizabeth. but they're on the brink. We are on the brink as a nation. We have just come through the French and Indian War. We are on the brink of major war with Great Britain. And of course, that's the American Revolution. As Jackson approaches his teenage years, though, this is when the British Army shows up in force and with a great deal of purpose in the Carolinas. The intention is to cause civil war across the frontier, to divide communities, to divide British sympathizers, American sympathizers, and essentially create as much chaos as they can. Jackson is going to be involved very intimately in these affairs. First of all, as a younger, a tween, as we would say today, he's watching his oldest brother, Hugh, go off to the American Army. Hugh dies as a result of the Battle of Stono Ferry of heat exhaustion during the battle. And that experience for the younger Jackson seems to really inspire him, his brother Robert, who's 15 at the time, to join the American Army. Not uncommon in those days, as I'm sure you know, to allow teenagers to serve in a military capacity. The boys are largely serving as scouts, as messengers, as couriers, but they are going to have combat experience, and that's going to come in 1780. In the August of that year at the Battle of Hanging Rock. And shortly after that, just within a few months, the British are continuing to wreak havoc across the frontier. The two boys, Robert and Andrew, are laying hidden in the woods so that they can avoid arrest by British soldiers. They are spotted by a neighbor, and the neighbor reports them to the British Army. She is a British sympathizer. The picture you see in front of you is where the nickname Brave Boy of the Waxhaws is first used. So this is not a nickname that comes about in Jackson's lifetime. It is very much a nickname in how we remember Andrew Jackson and in the beginning this mythology of Jackson, right? So let me break this down just a little bit. So the image, as you see, is a British soldier there off to the left side, and he has got a sword raised, about to swipe down at the teenage Andrew Jackson, who's got his left hand up to protect himself from that sword. When the boys are arrested, during the course of the arrest, Jackson is given an order by this British officer, and that is to clean his boots. Jackson refuses. He says, I am your prisoner. You cannot compel me to do this. Officer clearly doesn't take that so well and goes to slash down at Jackson. That saber comes down. Jackson puts up his hand to protect himself, and that sword cuts down through the meat of his left hand nearly in half. So his hand is almost completely severed at that point. The wound does heal. He does not lose a hand over it. And then that sword is also going to hit him in the forehead. Now, you have never seen this scar or this dent in Jackson's skull. You've seen plenty of pictures of Jackson with all that swoopy hair coming down over his forehead. So, the secret, there's actually a wound up under there. And then Jackson, of course, is taken prisoner, sent to a POW camp in South Carolina, where he contracts smallpox, as does his brother Robert. Robert dies, Andrew recovers, and then his mother dies about 6 weeks later. So when we look at this nickname, the Brave Boy of the Waxhaws, it's first used in 1876. The date should ring a bell for you. This is the centennial anniversary of the nation and the nation's founding. And just like I am told about the bicentennial years, there was a great deal of romanticism around the celebration of our nation's founding. There was a great deal of art, music, literature, sculpture that was being produced, a lot of writing about American history that's coming out in the 1870s, all as a way of shaping our view of the past. And so this image was produced by the very popular lithographers, Currier and Ives. I'm sure those names probably don't need any introduction, who specialized in Romanticism and history paintings. So the Brave Boy of the Waxhaws was one in a series of images that Currier and Ives produced related to that centennial anniversary. And so we often see the Brave Boy of the Waxhaws as a nickname applied post Jackson's life, right? More than 100 years later. You saw this name being used with some frequency throughout the remainder of the 19th century. When you roll into early textbooks into the early 20th century up through about the 1950s, you see this term used extensively as well. And it was seized on by authors and others who, especially those who are writing books for students, right? Textbooks, but also just young popular fiction about our leaders and about our country's history. So this term, the brave boy of the Waxhaws, is going to play into American popular memory, although it is not a period nickname. So I've tried to give some of these, I've tried to give all of these nicknames we're going to talk about today accuracy ratings. And I'm going to go ahead and say that the accuracy rating for Brave Boy of the Waxhaws is excellent. It comes about 100 years after this experience. But when we look at those early years of Jackson's life, when we consider the fact that Jackson is completely orphaned by the age of 15, that he has had combat experience, that he has had prisoner of war experience. And by the way, the only of the 45 men serving as president, Jackson's the only POW amongst them. We would not have had a second one until John McCain, if John McCain had been elected in 2008. So far as I feel like we can apply that nickname to Andrew Jackson's life, about his early formative years, I feel like this is an excellent one. I feel like that would work very, very well. All right. Let's move up a few years though to Jackson's midlife. So as Jackson ages, he is going to study the law. It is the study of law that will eventually get him to Tennessee. Tennessee still being an extension of North Carolina, where he acquires his law license in 1788. He's sent to Tennessee to become the public prosecutor of the Marrow District of North Carolina. That's a region today that would be central middle Tennessee, the Nashville area, and what is surrounding us. But Jackson is a man who is striving for influence. When Jackson is very young, right at this 15-year-old mark, completely orphaned, he spends a couple of years living in Charleston, South Carolina. It gives him time to both blow off some steam. If you're a Bible reader, if you've read the parable of the prodigal son, I see a lot of Jackson in that account, given those early teenage or those later teenage years when he's having to both deal with the trauma of war and orphanhood and plan for the future ahead of him. But Jackson sort of comes to his senses, and by the age of 18, he is studying the law. His goal in life is to be a man of influence, which is why he studies the law. This is post-revolution. The Constitution is just on the verge of being ratified in 1787, and people are looking to the lawyers, right? We're a new nation, a new government with new laws, a lot of holdover laws from England, but are they going to be exercised the same way? How is the nation going to run? And so people are looking to the lawyers, and this is where Jackson decides to put his efforts moving forward, because Jackson wants to be a nation builder. So his influence, the way he perceives what type of influence he wants to have or represent in his communities, is in community and nation building. All right. So those early experiences are going to feed that need to see the nation succeed. One of the ways, specifically for our purposes today, that Jackson is going to add to that body of influence, or his portfolio of influence, if you will, is that by 1802, Jackson has been so involved in helping establish the state's constitution. He's helping to guide the establishment of Tennessee as a state, although he never serves as governor. He's our first congressional representative. He's one of our first senators. He helps to found the Masonic Lodge here in Nashville. He was a Freemason. He serves a term on the Tennessee Supreme Court. He is still a circuit riding judge and lawyer. But by 1802, Jackson is elected to the position of Major General of the Tennessee State Militia. Now, militia service in Tennessee, unlike in some other parts of the country, was considered pro forma. This is what men did. And while Jackson never has militia experience as a rank and file foot soldier or officer, he is elected straight in as its general. He defeats John Sevier for that position. He is his competitor in that way. John Sevier himself, a hero of the Revolution at the Battle of Kings Mountain. So here comes Andrew Jackson, who is 35 at this point. He is leading the state's militia. At the time, the state did not include what today is West Tennessee, over near Memphis, between the Tennessee and the Mississippi rivers. Jackson is their commanding officer. Primarily, their function is to help establish settlements across the frontier, protect from Native American attacks, provide access to shipping routes, and that sort of thing. But of course, by 1807, we are headed back towards war with Great Britain. And by 1812, we are certainly back at war. So Jackson, as the leader of the Tennessee militia, is approached by James Madison, who then is president, and by James Monroe, who is then the Secretary of War and later Secretary of War and State for Madison. The men reach out to Jackson, asking him to put out a call for volunteers to the Tennessee State Militia and to the men of the region to swell the ranks of the militia, at which point Madison will put the U.S. 7th Infantry at Jackson's disposal, and then these men are expected to remain in readiness at whatever point they are asked to fight on behalf of their country. And the way Madison and Monroe are envisioning the use of the Tennessee militia is against Native Americans. The Native Americans are creating these pan-Indian alliances with Great Britain as in an attempt to encircle American settlements from the West and the South and assist the British on essentially squeezing in on American settlement. And so Jackson is on tap to be ready. Now, the nickname itself, Old Hickory, as the story goes, comes about because the men are first sent in the winter of 1812 towards New Orleans. Andrew Jackson is contacted. He has put out this call for the militia. The militia ranks swell to over 5,000 men. Jackson had only expected to have about 2,500. He ends up with 5,200. This is the beginning of Tennessee getting a nickname, the volunteer state. And so as the men are marching towards New Orleans, it's wintertime, it's December of 1812. They get as far as Natchez, Mississippi, so very close to New Orleans, when Jackson is contacted by Monroe and told, never mind, your men are not needed in this engagement. You need to just turn them loose and everybody can go home now. So the way Jackson interprets Monroe's instructions is that he's literally supposed to turn loose of the men that he commands and they can find their own way home. This is the way that Jackson interprets Monroe's instructions. Monroe, we're not sure what he meant by turn them loose and they'll figure out how to get back home, but Jackson interprets it that way. In February of 1813, the men begin their return back to Nashville. And illness, as you can imagine, exposure to the elements is plaguing these men. There's problems with dysentery. The flu is rampant. Camp fever is rampant. Jackson himself has just come through a pretty significant injury. In this image, you can see his arm is here in a sling. And that's because of a wound that he received breaking his left arm in a tavern brawl with Thomas Hart and Jesse Benton only a few months previous to this. But Jackson himself has been very ill. He had what appears to have been the flu, perhaps dysentery himself. Jackson realizes that his men, his soldiers, are in far worse condition than he is. And so he turns over his horses, his conveyances, all of the transportation at his disposal and makes it available, saying there are men who are sicker than I am. They need it. I'll walk. Jackson walks the entire way back to Nashville. As his soldiers observe him doing this, one of them is said to have exclaimed, "There he goes, tough as Old Hickory," and the name sticks. It's a wonderful nickname in Nashville. It's used everywhere. There's so many versions of the name Old Hickory used on buildings and neighborhoods and streets around our area. But that image of Old Hickory, right, this tough and seasoned wood, I think applies quite nicely. So it's a familiar story to us, but there's a few additional aspects to this that I want to tease out. First of all, this is not Jackson's first major walk under these types of conditions. Here I said it's not his first hike, but I didn't mean it as a recreational opportunity. Jackson, after having been wounded by the British officer as he's being taken prisoner, he contracts smallpox as they are walking towards the camp in South Carolina. Robert, being sicker than Andrew, is allowed a medical transfer. Jackson walks. Smallpox, wounded head, wounded hand. Jackson walks at the age of 14, 40 miles to Camden, South Carolina. So having this type of arduous foot journey under adverse medical conditions in wartime is a familiar story to Jackson. And I find that he's pulling from that experience to help him sort of endure this one, but to also help him understand the plight of the men that serve under him as well. So when it comes to an accuracy rating, I'm going to say this is pretty excellent. I think this works. There is a book that was recently published by Tony Turnbow, who lives here in the Nashville area. I'm going to drop it in the chat feature real quick. So Tony L. Turnbow, and the book was called Hardened to Hickory. And the book is going to focus on this chapter of Jackson's life. He brings out some additional stories and information about Jackson's positioning with the Tennessee militia in preparation of the War of 1812. So it goes into quite a bit more detail about that story and breaks it apart a little bit. So I'm going to recommend it in all your free time when you have all this free time to read about Andrew Jackson's nicknames. Okay, hang on a second. There we go. All right. So certainly, I couldn't decide on just one image for this one. So certainly for the hero of New Orleans, that nickname, I'll be very honest, was one that I was not familiar with when I started working at the Hermitage. I'd certainly heard Old Hickory. I'd heard the common man's hero. I'd even heard the people's president before, right? But the hero of New Orleans, I at first just thought, yeah, okay, so he's the winning general of this incredible victory over the British at New Orleans. Yeah, he is the hero of New Orleans, right? I mean, he wins the battle. But that nickname is used in print for Jackson more than almost any nickname that he is given. This nickname is going to get used constantly throughout Jackson's life post New Orleans, even as it relates to the presidency. If you are studying political cartoons, if you bring your students into using political cartoons with those visual thinking strategies, which are so wonderful, you're going to find that term used so often. For example, there's a wonderful series of cartoons that are done during the bank crisis, the bank war. And often, General Jackson is referred to as general more often than he's referred to as president. And several times they'll refer to him as the hero of New Orleans. And often it's a mockery. Just because you were the hero of New Orleans does not mean you know what to do about the bank. Just because you were the hero of New Orleans doesn't mean you're the hero of everything you put your hand to. And so I was surprised to find that term used in a little mockery in those political cartoons, chance to make a few jibes at Jackson. As an accuracy rating, I'm going to give this one an excellent. If you're familiar with the details of the battle at New Orleans, then you'll know what I mean already. What Jackson accomplishes at New Orleans is astounding. The speed of the battle, the overwhelming casualties that the British suffer, and the overwhelming lack of casualties that the Americans suffer just stagger people. There's almost no other way to explain it. Nobody in the United States has seen, we have not achieved a battle like this before, right? Not even in the Revolution. You look at some of the greatest battles of the Revolution, Monmouth Courthouse, Yorktown, of course, and they still don't live up to just the almost Hollywood-like status of the battle at New Orleans. So Jackson, of course, is facing down one of the greatest armies in the world. This army has already defeated Napoleon once. They're about to go back and do it at Waterloo just 8 months after the engagement at New Orleans. Jackson encounters the British at New Orleans in 3 different skirmishes before the major battle happens then in January of 1815. And what Jackson is using to shore up his army at the battle, I think is where the real heroism really lies. Go with me for a second. There's a real heroism looking at just Jackson's army. Jackson is desperate for men. When after defeating the Creek in Alabama in 1814, he goes to Florida, he goes throughout the Gulf Coast states, ends up in New Orleans by December of 1814, and he has lost men. So all of those 5,200 men that leave Tennessee to go to Alabama, they leave. Their enlistments are over. They leave after the battle at Horseshoe Bend that defeats Muscovy Nation. And then Jackson has to rebuild his army because there's no way his force of about 12 to 1,500 men can face what is coming as the British are approaching the Gulf. So Jackson is reaching for literally anybody who can support his efforts. And this, I think, can be a phenomenal lesson for our students. Um, because listen to some of these details. Jackson gets to New Orleans with the remains of the Tennessee militia. He has picked up additional militias across Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. He arrives with professional soldiers from the U.S. 7th Infantry. Jackson also ends up taking on at least two battalions, large battalions of free people of color, free men of color. Many of those men had previously been fighting the French Revolution, or I'm sorry, against the French during the Haitian Revolution. And here, come these two massive battalions. Colonel Joseph Savary is a wonderful story that comes out of that. They add to Jackson's force. Jackson accepts the assistance of Choctaw Nation. They come to Jackson's aid. Slaves are being commandeered from their owners to serve in support capacity. And as always, the best part of the story, bar none, is that Jackson ends up with pirates. So here you have this wonderful, almost ragtag group of soldiers that are very committed to the success of the United States. Sometimes that is self-interested. The pirates, for example, are very self-interested. Jackson has agreed to secure them federal pardons in exchange for their assistance at New Orleans in helping to navigate the terrain, which is very complex there on the Gulf Coast. So there's a lot of self-interest involved in this, but they still do it, and they still achieve a victory that is unmatched. To this point. The strength of the victory at New Orleans almost can't be stated strongly enough. In case you're not quite familiar with the outcome of the Battle of New Orleans, the British Army of roughly 9,000 men show up in force. They receive nearly 3,000 casualties within about 37 to 40 minutes. Jackson's army of roughly 5,000 men suffer a total of about 71 casualties within about 37 to 40 minutes. Of those 71 casualties, only 13 are killed in action. And of the 13 killed in action, only 7 are killed by the British Army. The other 6 of those go to reload a cannon. It explodes in their faces. And so that is an error, human error, that leads to those deaths. Immediately upon the receipt of this news, there is no other nickname for Jackson but the Hero of New Orleans. That is what begins to get used from 1815 steadily until Jackson's death at 1845. There are a couple of other nicknames that come out of this period that will apply to the American Army in general. And so Jackson would have fallen under that heading. The Hunters of Kentucky, for example, is, you might have heard the song, you might have seen the broadside. They present Jackson's army as these mythological creatures, half horse, half alligator. If any of you drink Abita beer, Abita is a brewery out of New Orleans. They have a beer called the Andy Gator, and it's an Andrew Jackson focused beer. And on the packaging, it shows the horse and the alligator, and the head of it is Andrew Jackson. So just a fun little quick New Orleans reference if you're at the store and you happen to see something by Abita Brewery. It's the Andy Gator. So all of this terminology coming out of 1815 is so powerful for mythology building and just stoking Jackson up to these almost mythical proportions, right? We see this language used for the remainder of Jackson's life. It's in the writings about Jackson ever afterwards until, some of our more recent decades. All right, this is where I want to get your feedback for a second. So I'll give you just a second. I'll ask you to drop a few things into the chat for me. I feel like with all the other nicknames that we've just looked at, the images that express those nicknames are pretty clearly understood. You see the brave boy, you see the hero of New Orleans, right? He's on the horse with the hat up, and the Cathedral of St. Louis is in the background. But this image right here, the one on your left, I love working with this when I'm working with students. I don't know if any of you use visual thinking strategies in your classroom. I hope you do. As an adult, it has been absolutely one of my favorite ways of learning. So taking just a moment, look at the image on the left. This is one of the first images as President of the United States that people are seeing about Andrew Jackson. And the nickname that gets attached to this man in this image is the man of the people. So use those visual thinking strategies and tell me from this image, what says to you that this is the man of the people? What conveys that man of the people status? Laura Cruz, thank you. A bold, direct gaze. I like that. Looks thoughtful. That's from Mary Tolsky. Looks thoughtful, forward looking. Okay. So Mary, I really like yours. Feel free to expand on that just a little bit. The arm sticking out of the shirt. So TLJ the second. I'm curious about that one. Expand on that just a little bit for me, if you don't mind. Lack of superfluous clothes. Ashley Hahn, thank you. You know, this is more commonly dressed. James Jager, yes, absolutely. Common dress of the time. It's not so polished. A simple coat, no symbols of education or power in the setting. Yes. When I do this with students, fourth graders, I don't know if I've really done it with younger than fourth grade, but with fourth graders and up, that's the first thing they mention are his clothes. Okay. And TLJ, I see your comment. I'm going to get to there in just a second. So it's the clothes. I had one student finally just say to me, he was like, well, it's the cloak. And I was like, okay, open that up a little bit. What do you know, what does the cloak say to you? And he sort of looked at me for a second, like, duh, Miss Erin. And he said, it's covering up his clothes. You don't know how wealthy he is or isn't. It's just a dark, normal cloak like normal people wear. And I loved that. I'm so glad he noticed that right off. TLJ, you were talking about the hand coming out of the cloak, and then you brought that back to the Waxhaws, to the brave boy at the Waxhaws. That is really fascinating. I've never linked that before. That is his left hand, right? Yes, that is his left hand in the image there. So perhaps it is a bit of putting that scar on display, which can't terribly well see, but people were familiar with this story of Jackson at the time. Heidi Piacek, and I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, but Heidi, you said he looks confident but a bit disheveled. Mary Catherine Bailey had a question, were previous presidents painted in color and AJ in black and white? That is, no, that is, we can't say that categorically, Mary Catherine. It's, there are a lot of these sort of ink and pen drawings. There's plenty of representations of all of these presidents, both in color and in black and white. So I don't know if that is, but what I like about the black and white in this case is that it makes the image very simple. It draws attention to the details very, very quickly. Oh, okay. Okay, Mary Catherine, thank you for expanding. So she responded, I mean, this image is black and white and others we often see in color. Okay, I gotcha. You know, students often point out that disheveled piece a lot too. They talk about his hair always looks like it's blowing in the wind. And Jackson characterized himself as a man who was born for a storm and a calm did not suit him. That is his quote. And so the kids often think, yeah, it's like somebody is standing there facing down something that's rushing towards them. He's standing out in a blustery wind and he's just rock steady, right, and firm. And so people are taking this image of Jackson and thinking, yeah, he looks like a pretty normal guy. You know, he looks approachable. He looks dependable. He looks like a man of his word. Not to say they didn't think that necessarily about the men before Jackson, but you never see Washington without the military uniform. And Jefferson was clearly, you know, a wealthy planter. You see that in his clothing and in his sort of portrayal of himself. This was known. What Jackson has to offer here is just a plain cloak, you know, and like a man who's ready to sort of settle down and get to work. Several of you mentioned, and I wanted to draw this back out, Jackson's gaze. And I think that is so important. I am not familiar with a single image of Andrew Jackson where his gaze is ever directed straight at the viewer. Jackson is almost always looking off to the left side, just a little bit. And that suggests to me somebody who is almost hyper aware. Like he knows what's happening right in front of him. He can see it, but he's also can see who just came around the corner over here. He just caught a little glimpse of what was happening back over here on this side. He can see kind of, he's got that peripheral gaze going as well. And so all this suggests to me that Jackson is the master of himself. He is committed, he is engaged, and he is a normal guy like normal guys are. Okay, so let's look at the other image for a second. When you may use this in your classrooms, I hope you do. I absolutely love it. Jackson first gets this nickname, the man of the people, because of his decision to invite the citizens to attend the inauguration. right? This invitation goes out. Jackson invites citizens to gather in Washington, D.C. He has the inauguration brought out of the Capitol building and out to the steps. And today, this is the order of events that we don't question at the inauguration. It's going to be public. Even with COVID, right? At President Biden's inauguration, they found a way to make that available to the public, not only through TV or streaming internet service or something, but to actually have people gathered in front of the US Capitol building to witness this transfer, which is an incredible step forward for the people of the United States. To the best of my knowledge, the only inauguration that did not happen outside since Jackson was one of maybe Reagan's second inauguration, where the temperature was so bitterly cold in Washington, D.C., that they moved it inside to the rotunda of the Capitol. They still televised it and citizens still watched it. But the image that you're looking at reflects Robert Cruikshank, who is the artist. It reflects sort of his view of how this event happened. So take a moment, focus on it. How does this image of the inauguration at the Capitol, that doesn't even include Andrew Jackson in it, how does this show the man of the people? Chaotic. Yes, Ashley Hahn, I totally agree. James, clearly plain dressed people invited, not the aristocracy. White House party. That White House party is the stuff of legends, isn't it? The variety of people present. My students noticed the horse rearing, the variety of clothing. Cameron May, looks like a big party. Crowds gathered for a purpose. Raquel, yes. Kicking horse as an interesting choice to include. Mary, I think you're exactly right. So you look at this combination of people, animals, vehicles, and there's all this sense of rushing movement in towards the steps of the Capitol building, all kinds of people. Yes, I hope you can see it well from where you are, but when you look at, I always look in the very center of the foreground, and you might see the lady in sort of a pinkish red dress. She's got a green bonnet on her head. The man standing just to her left, you can see he's got no shoes on. His pants are rolled up above his ankles. Right, it's March, but it's suggesting this is some hillbilly yokel that just rolled up out of the hills and the hollers, to come to Washington for this. One detail that I don't think shows up very well to you just in this format is that the lady that I just pointed out with that green bonnet next to the man with no shoes, the people along this front row, there's also clouds of dust being stirred up under their feet. It suggests somebody's running or rushing, right? No security, Heidi, absolutely. And I just grimace at the carriage that's right there towards the right where the horse is rearing and kicking up. But mostly it's because of the driver who's just flinging that whip around like he's not going to hit somebody with it. So here you have America in all of its diversity and fineness, right? You've got people with no shoes. You've got a few people that are pretty well dressed. You've got vehicles, it's a mob scene. In fact, some people are so concerned about what's happening at the Capitol building that they think the riotous mob is here to stay, to eat all their food, bring all their diseases, trample Washington into the dust, and be done. So is this accurate? Is this nickname accurate? It depends. The ones we've already looked at, I think historically, there's not a lot to question there. But this one is the one where I feel like we might start to have a depends on the accuracy rating of the nickname. Because when we look at the man of the people, we know who the man is, and that's Jackson. Do we know who the people are? Okay, and how does that man link to those people? So in this particular case, Andrew Jackson is the man of the people. One subject that we have gotten into rather heavily here lately is the definition of the people and the definition of citizenship in the nation and how the president serves the people. In this case, we can define the people according to the man. The man is Andrew Jackson, a white landholding slave owner from the southern states, a veteran, a great military hero, a man who has a great deal of common experience to the people of the time. And yet the people of his time do not include women. It does not include It does not necessarily include people of color. It certainly does not include enslaved people. Free people of color had varying and assorted rights, and varying and assorted ways of exercising them. It definitely does not include Native Americans. So I feel like we can see a lot of exceptions to this. But when we think of the people of Jackson's day, is he their president? It's something to consider. We'll talk about it. Okay. All right. So moving into the presidency, then here is Andrew Jackson, the common man's hero, the man of the people, right? This is the man we have sent to Washington. We have sent to Washington, not just the aristocrats of New England, right? We have sent him. And Jackson is going to shake things up in a powerful way. You all do not need me to tell you this, but from the beginning, right? Jackson comes in with only one legislative priority. His one legislative priority is Indian removal. It's the Indian Removal Act, which is going to take about a year for him to accomplish when it is signed into law on May 30th, 1830. But Jackson has other goals that he comes in with. And those goals we see in so many of his actions. He wants to prove to foreign nations that America is strong, that we don't need their interference. We don't need them to step in and to make any sort of suggestions, to wield any influence or power. We're going to take care of this ourselves. He has demonstrated that through his military experience, but he has also demonstrated that in the ways in which he's been involved in wresting land from Native peoples, his role in the Seminole Wars, his role in getting Florida territory acquired to the United States. So Jackson's going to step in, already with a background in how to show national strength. He wants to help balance the powers of the state and the federal government. He believes in states' rights, no question about that, but never at the expense of the Union. That is what Jackson is not going to be able to give up. And when you go all the way back to the brave boy of the Waxhaws, you can see why. When you look at the success at New Orleans, you can see why Jackson is a Unionist first and foremost. His own words are going to bear that out. He's going to face that first secession crisis with South Carolina. And the nullification crisis, which just doesn't get enough attention. I'm really passionate about the nullification crisis. But Jackson is going to, through the nullification crisis, find a way to add to the president's toolbox those powers that are necessary for keeping the nation together. It's exactly the toolbox that Lincoln will reach for later. And that is specifically the force bill, that the president will have the right to take military action against citizens in order to keep the nation together. Jackson is going to get a nickname for this. The way he wields the veto powers, the way he is reshaping the relationships between the executive and the legislative branches and the judicial branches, the way he's reshaping the centrality of the relationships in government, that it becomes a relationship of the executive with the people and not the executive with Congress, unlike his predecessors. This is shaking everything up. People don't know what to think of Andrew. So he begins to get this nickname, right? King Andrew the First. And if there's anybody that you might think you would never apply a monarchical nickname to, it would be Andrew Jackson, right? Jackson and Washington, right, who both defeated the King of Great Britain. And yet we're going to give him this monarchy nickname. People had a great deal of fear that Jackson would rule as Napoleon had ruled, right? This great military genius helps secure freedoms and liberties and then turns them around for self-interest. Those fears are not realized, fortunately, with Andrew Jackson, but it doesn't stop him from getting these nicknames, right? So I love this political cartoon of Jackson. This one was created right in 1833. We have just come through nullification. We have just come through the Bank War, as it's called, in which Jackson has been fighting to defeat the second bank of the United States. He is successful in vetoing that may be, and according to some historians, and I'm sort of in agreement, I gotta keep working on that a bit, that veto is the most powerful and most important veto in presidential history because of the way it shapes the power of the executive branch. Jackson signs veto 12 times, right? One of them is the Bank War, and that's where this image comes from. By vetoing the charter of the Bank of the United States, he picks up the nickname King Andrew the First, born to command, had I been consulted, of veto memory, right? And take a look at this image. I'm going to let you do this for a second. Look at these, just look at some of the different elements of this image. People are very concerned about Jackson. So what to you are some of the highlights of this image that you would pull out for your students? Trampling the Constitution. Yes, number one. Number one, you almost can't hardly see anything else, right? He's standing right on the Constitution of the United States. Can anybody read? Can any of you, he's holding the veto in his hand. Yep, absolutely. Can any of you read the title that's on that book laying on the floor in front of the Constitution? Yeah, the word monarchy, I mean, it is still pretty ugly. It's a bitterly ugly contested word. Um, the United States is not that old, y'all, right? We're what, 70, not even 70 years old at this point. Like, how our fears of a monarchy, assuming government, are not done at this point. So here's my thing. You guys have pulled out, is the eagle holding a globe? I don't think that's what is intended, Mary Catherine. That use of the eagle as like as a decorative touch for the supporting of like leg furniture is common during this period. I think it's meant to just show the subjugation of the nation, that's what he is doing in this case. So I don't think it's holding a globe. At least I'm not familiar with any actual pieces of furniture that use the eagle leg holding a globe. Doesn't mean that's not what the artist intends. I don't see enough details on it, unfortunately. Yes, so the book on the floor says Judica of the United States, the laws of the United States. He's pitched it down, pages are ripped out. He's standing on the Constitution, and here he stands holding the scepter and the veto, right? If you think about those images of the monarchs of England that hold the scepter and the globe capped by the cross, right? That these are the symbols of their power and the symbols of their authority and what they have the God-given right to use. You could contrast this image, I would think, with your students with one of King George III or the British monarch of the time. It's King William IV at this point, right? But any sort of a coronation image of a monarch of England, you're going to find a lot of comparable points that you can make that I think will help deepen the impact that this cartoon was intended to have. So, Jackson, so why is Jackson going in with such a heavy hand, right? Why would he do anything that would provoke the charge of a monarchy or the criticism of this monarchical behavior when people are so clearly afraid of it? And when it so clearly seems to go against the concept of Jackson as the man of the people. And yet the people love the guy, right? This does not deter anybody. Jackson's reelection rate is in the top 5 reelection margins in history. So this isn't enough to slow the voters down in any case. But what it is a reflection of Jackson's actions. All right, but we have to cover 2 more nicknames that just we can't ignore. First of all, Jackson achieves the nickname Jack the Devil, and this is a nickname that is specific to Cherokee Nation. And by Cherokee Nation, I mean the Cherokee people. So Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, as well as the United Band of Pettua and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, which are today's federally recognized branches of the Cherokee people. So Jack the Devil is the nickname. I was blown away to notice that the artist for this particular cartoon is Thomas Nast. So if you're studying Tammany Hall, Civil War political cartoons, you know the name Thomas Nast. This is also a Nast cartoon. And Nast is very much trying to criticize Jackson's actions related not only to the Indian Removal Act, but all of the fallout for that, right? So Andrew Jackson goes into office with one priority, that is the Indian Removal Act. He is determined to pass it. In many ways, I think Jackson sees Native Americans and the acquisition of their land as an issue where we have been kicking the can down the road for so long, and it's time for somebody to just step in and solve the issue. The problem, of course, I don't have to tell you, is that the solution is going to upend for generations the lives of entire groups of people, an entire group of people. because what Jackson does is not specific to the Cherokee, although that's the story we know so much, but it is intended in every way to put all Native peoples within the boundaries of the United States on notice. It is meant to apply to all Native peoples, and it is today an effective law in the United States. It is still on the books. The Supreme Court recently tackled it again in 2020 with a case called McGirt versus Oklahoma. And Oklahoma, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, has appealed the Supreme Court's upholding of the treaties that Jackson signed. And so that has been appealed again. And so surprisingly, the Supreme Court is going to tackle that case again. There's nothing that's going to stop Jackson. Kelly Graves, you're not wrong. There's nothing that was going to stop Jackson at this point, because to him, he saw it as a problem that had to be solved, that the very advancement of the nation depended on it. You see that in the language he uses. Read the Indian Removal Act sometime, please. Read the second annual message to Congress, because he very conveniently for us lays out reason number one, reason number two, and goes through his reasons in that way. So Jack the Devil is the Cherokee nickname. I think we can all agree that he earns that nickname amongst the Cherokee people. And so what we often blame Jackson for is the Trail of Tears, right? That's become sort of the shorthand language. But what Jackson is responsible for is in many ways far worse than the Trail of Tears, because it isn't specific to the Cherokee, and it is meant to apply to any indigenous people occupying territory that the United States intends to acquire. Okay, that has far more reaching consequences. So Jack the Devil, is this nickname accurate? It depends. People of Jackson's time certainly looked at Jackson in a positive light for taking this step. Indian removal is a fiercely contested topic in Congress. The vote to secure Indian removal is not close at all in the Senate. It's kind of a slam dunk in the Senate, but it is bitterly fought in the House of Representatives. If you are in New Jersey, you need to be reading about Theodore Frelinghuysen. I recommend that highly. If you're in Tennessee, you need to be reading about David Crockett. If you're in Ohio, and really I recommend this for everybody, the ladies of Steubenville, Ohio, submit a letter to Jackson asking him to rethink Indian Removal Act. Catherine Beecher, the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, leads the first women's mass activism movement in the United States because of Indian removal. So we've got just a quick minute. Does anybody want to make a quick observation about this image? It is incredibly powerful to me. And I'll deny myself the pleasure of telling you about the last image too much if anybody wants to drop something in on this. Okay, well, a couple of images I do want to point out to you. The picture that you're looking at right here, again, done by Thomas Nast, and this is done by Thomas Nast. It is meant to portray Jackson. It is meant to mock his paternal attitude towards Native Americans and that he is holding them like children. The picture over his shoulder, the framed image on the wall shows Lady Columbia standing with her foot on the neck of Andrew Jackson, trying to indicate that this is not the way. Sue Cagley, yes, they look like dolls being played with, right? Or children being played with. Sharp Knife, this is the nickname that comes to Jackson from the Creek Nation of people for much the same reason. I have sent this presentation to Mark Adams, so you'll already see the rest of those details. So let me finish with this, folks. The People's President, that is the nickname that we still use for Andrew Jackson today at the Hermitage. In fact, the name of our site is Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, home of the People's President. What does that mean today? When we first started using the nickname the People's President, I just thought surely we're not. Because if I were a person of color, I'm a woman. If I was a Native person, not my president, right? We've heard that hashtag a lot lately. So what does this mean to Jackson today and for his legacy today? First of all, the image you see is his official presidential portrait. And Jackson intentionally asked the portrait artist, Ralph Earl, to paint him facing away from the White House so that you can see the Capitol building in the background. Again, making that link, the People's President, the man of the people. He wanted the Capitol building to be shown. So who are the people? The definition of who the people are today may be different than it is in Jackson's time, but I will leave this with you and submit that what Jackson sets in motion as president, the decisions he makes, the way he goes about them, is enough to give people the idea that the citizen has a powerful role in shaping the presidency and influencing the decisions of the president. And that had not happened before Jackson in a meaningful way. And so what Jackson sets in motion is still very much the legacy that we live under today. So thank you very much for your time. Like I mentioned, I sent this to Mark and to Therese, and they'll make sure to get all of that to everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. We appreciate it. I did drop in the chat the link to our teacher conference site that's going to have all of the resources. And on that page is Erin's presentation already. So
Marvelous.